Welcome to Shutter and Flow. We're going to pick back up today where we left off last week, and we're going to talk about some back-end kind of post-production-y sort of things. We're going to talk about file types. We're going to talk about some color space things and some metadata. So I'm not an expert in these things, but have a lot more experience than most people, I think, in the industry. Jeremy, what's your experience in all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I know the basics from my end, from the photo end, about the sRGB and the WR, like the different types for that end. But once you get into the print end of it specifically, not even getting near it on color space. File types, I'm pretty comfortable with just because I've seen the output for so many different reasons and see all the different new cameras, how they process them, all of that. But I could always be learning more, and everyone should always be learning more because it's always changing. Like that Hasselblad that I shot with the other day, totally different file type, totally different everything. And I feel like most people just leave their cameras set on whatever it is and don't adjust anything. And lately I've noticed new cameras is doing everything in the most basic compressed version native when you take it out of the box. So if you don't change anything, you're going to be limited on what it has the possibility to do. So where do you want to start? Do you want to start color or file type?
So kind of a little bit of both. So let's start talking a little bit about processing engines. So basically, when you think of your camera shooting RAW files plus JPEGs, that camera, whichever camera you're using, is rendering that JPEG internally with the software built in the camera. So what it's doing is it's taking the raw file or whatever it's shooting and it's compressing that into a JPEG. It's throwing away all the information that it doesn't need and it's processing it into a JPEG. Whatever your color settings are set up on your camera, that's what it's going to use. So that's kind of first and foremost. Those JPEGs that are being processed out of your camera may not be the best quality color for whatever you're shooting. So if you're shooting a JPEG only workflow and you only need JPEGs out of the camera to send somewhere, if they're just for review, it doesn't really matter, right? Because nobody's really looking at the color. They're just looking at the content of the shot. It's totally fine. Not a problem. If you're using those JPEGs for any reason, you may want to consider those JPEGs as JPEGs that are only used for review and then processing out files directly from the RAW. The reason for that being that you're not really 100% sure what color space those are in or how it's being processed on the camera, unless you dig really deep into the camera itself, which you can do if you are shooting a JPEG only workflow and you want to make sure that whatever's being shot out of the camera has a good color space. You can color calibrate your camera. There's ways to do that. Each camera is going to be a little bit different, and it's sometimes a pain, but you can spend a day, look some YouTube videos up for your camera. I'm sure you can figure it out.
Yeah, most cameras have it where you can build out a color profile. Fuji's probably the best at it. And load that into your custom settings. And if you want to have that same look every time and know that that's how you're going to shoot JPEG only, process that out, it can do that really well, but I find it very limiting. You're just limiting what you can do.
So it just depends on what you shoot, right? Because there are some people that it just makes sense if they're shooting events or something else. It might just make sense to spend a little bit of time going through the cameras that they have, color calibrating those cameras, setting up a space for them to make sure that the JPEGs they're shooting are high quality JPEGs. If they don't need to deal with raw files, they don't want to deal with raw files. Maybe they're shooting thousands of images in an event or wedding or something else. I'm not really sure what wedding photographers do these days, but that is an option. If you're shooting anything else, I would suggest just using JPEGs for review purposes and raw files as the actual working files that you'll use for anything else. So that kind of brings us to the processing engine side of it. So if you're processing your files through Adobe, whether it's opening it in Photoshop or using Bridge or Lightroom to process something out, it's using Adobe Camera Raw, so ACR. ACR is actually really great with color. It does process differently than something like Capture One. So you have to think of these things as different processing engines. So just adding the same color space doesn't necessarily give you the same file. If you want to do a test it out. Grab a raw file that you have, process it at the exact same type of JPEG, same size JPEG or TIFF, doesn't matter, and process it out through both of them, layer them in Photoshop. You will see a slight difference in them, in the way that they're processed. And that's because of the algorithms that are used to process out the images. So that's kind of the first place I want to start, is just to have a basic understanding of this. You don't really need to understand it all that much. But what I will say is this brings us to kind of the file types, or the output, what you're getting. So in order to output something, you have to choose a color space typically. Don't leave it in whatever native color space there is. If you're processing something yourself, you need to make sure that they're in the color space, right? So file types. The worst thing you can do to somebody who's working in post-production is to open up your files in Lightroom, you bring your raw files in there, play with some sliders. You're like, I think this looks great. I'm going to process out a file from here. Sometimes you're not even checking the color space. You're processing out a JPEG or a TIFF. You're sending that along with the raw files, but without any sidecar files with the raw files. And then you're asking somebody to, hey, just take the raw, make it look like this, and do something else. Here's the thing. There are a million different ways to apply settings to files. So to reverse engineer what somebody did, which I've had to do a lot of in my career, is an absolute nightmare. The nicest thing you can do for somebody is to just simply send them your sidecar files so they can see what you did. If they want, they can throw those settings away and tweak and start over if they feel like you've done something that's degrading the actual file itself in some way. So that's kind of first and foremost, right?
Well, and just
sidecar
real quick,
files.
Yeah, and real quick, just so people understand that, when you're in Capture One, when you're in Adobe RAW, when you do adjustments inside that folder, it normally creates another folder, or sometimes does its own file, an XMP file or whatever it may be for that all those settings are attached to that image that you're working on. And they're not, sometimes they can be attached, but it just shows you what is happening, but it is a separate file unless you bundle them together in Capture One, which is the EIP file, but can't be read on certain things. But it, just so people understand that when you're doing stuff in these softwares, it is creating a separate file that is a sidecar, like as you described it, that has all that information of what's going on.
And it sometimes will include metadata. It will include other things as well. And it will name it same as your file name, .xmp if you are using ACR, or like you said, if it's in Capture, it'll be in a Capture session folder. It used to be like .cos, something else. Or those, sometimes you can package it as an EIP for Capture, which is becoming, it was like a long time ago, not many people did it. Now more people do it. You can package it as an EIP, which is basically the raw file with all the settings as one file. So that's kind of first and foremost. Understand your workflow in terms of what you're doing, how you're shooting. If you're doing any settings or anything yourself, make sure that if you're transferring files to somebody else and you're sending them raw files, that's what you're sending. And you can go in, make changes, make settings, say, this is how I want this to look. This is what I like. Process out something, send it as that so they understand that, but don't then just throw away all of the work that you did and have somebody try to reverse engineer it. It's not always going to look the same. So that's kind of first and foremost. Second, when you're processing out files, understand what you're processing for. So if you're processing out files for review, you're likely going to need to process out an sRGB JPEG. So JPEGs, once again, they are very compressed files. They lose a ton of information. But you do not need to process out a TIFF or anything larger if it's for review. If it's going to web, just think JPEG, right? Or if you need to email it or send it or whatever, just think JPEG. And There are smaller file types. You can have a PNG or something like that, but PNGs are typically going to be something that's used for a web element. So don't think, oh, PNGs are smaller, I'll just process out photos as PNGs. You don't really need to use it unless you're building for a website or something that needs to load quickly. So for most part, most photographers can really only need to know about JPEGs, TIFFs, PSDs, which is an actual Photoshop file, or whatever RAW file they're shooting. So I would say,
well, real quick, and also let's just make sure a lot of cameras now, because of Apple switching over what they shoot on, there is the HEIC, which is a high efficiency image container. Similar to a JPEG, it is just a different compression format. You'll start seeing more of those. I noticed that some cameras are starting with that as the first option as opposed to doing a JPEG.
yeah, and those files are, I don't know. I like that file as a file type. However, not everything is currently set to read those files. So if you take an HEIC file, is it HEIC? Yeah. I think if you take one of those files, you are able to pull it off, send it anywhere, do whatever you want with it. You're able to open those files in Photoshop. You're able to open those files in other places. However, I don't always know if you were to like load it into software that you're sending for clients that'll always be visible, right? And emails, I'm not really 100% sure how they render in that. So for now, I would probably still use JPEG when you can, just because it's a universal file type that anybody that loads a JPEG on anything, their screen will render it. So they'll be able to see the JPEG. I would be a little cautious about using HEIC unless for some reason a client requests it for something.
Which I've never heard happen ever.
Yeah.
But I just noticed that even like the Hasselblad, it was set on that out of the box as opposed to JPEG, which I was kind of surprised about.
Yeah, that's surprising. It's just a different algorithm, and it's just the way that it compresses it. I know Apple phones, iPhones, whatever, like everything uses those file types. It makes sense on that platform. It doesn't always make sense to use it if you're going cross-platform with a bunch of different files. I would just kind of simplify, just think JPEG if you're going to compress something to send for web or review, and think TIFF if you're sending anything to print, and PSDs. So a little note about PSDs. If you are a photographer who likes to do some amount of work yourself, or layer files yourself and then send that to somebody, just send it as a PSD if they're going to work on it, because they'll be able to load it. It's lossless. PSDs are lossless, the same as a RAW file. So whatever you load into there, if you load your RAW file or you get JPEG or TIFF or something, you create that into a PSD, it's not going to compress it. So you're essentially ending up in a situation where you can transfer that PSD, do whatever you want to it, save it a bunch of times. You're not going to lose information. It's whatever gets processed out of that that's going to compress it down. So when you're working with files, whatever files, always think that you want compression to come at the end before delivery. So don't take your RAW files, save out a bunch of JPEGs, not even really paying attention. Send it to a retoucher. They're going to do stuff to those JPEGs. They're going to then save that as a PSD somewhere that you'll never see, compress them again into a JPEG and send it off. Why not send them a RAW file to work from? Or if you don't want to send them the RAW files, you can also send them high-res TIFF. High-res TIFF is kind of preferable than JPEGs. At least you have more information to work with. It is a compressed file format. It is just throwing away less information than a JPEG is throwing away. This kind of brings me to, before we talk about color, let's talk a little bit about bits. So used to be everything was 8-bit. And then Adobe decided to create 16-bit for some things, right? 16-bit, double the colors, right? Actually, it's more than double the colors, but just think of it as that. It's great for gamut, right? So if you think about the amount of colors that you're able to show, the different shades of a red or a blue, with 16-bit, you get so many more than you do with 8-bit. And so those colors show up amazing on a screen. Same for if you're going to be able to print that file. And I say if you're going to be able to print that file. And now there's even higher bit ratios, right? The problem with bit ratios is that I always suggest most people just stick with 8-bit. because typically the output files are going to be 8-bit anyway. You can't save a 16-bit JPEG. So typically you're going to stick with 8-bit. If these things are going to print, there may be the possibility of being able to print a 16-bit file. Typically, those files are still converted back into 8-bit. So I don't know. If things are just going to web, or you just want to see on your screen an absolutely beautiful TIFF file that's a 16-bit TIFF, but depending on what a client wants or what they're going to be able to use it for, it's typically kind of useless. I think most of the times anyone that shoots in 16-bit, the one thing that is useful for it is that if you have a file that is in 16-bit and then you need to essentially pull more out of the darks or pull down some of the highlights, it has more information there. So you're able to do it better, right? If you are trying to get rid of some noise, that file is going to have less noise in it. You're able to get some noise out of it. I've even done some crafty things where I've converted an 8-bit file into 16-bit, run a noise reduction on it, and then converted it back to 8-bit, and it does a better job of just doing it on 8-bit. But in general, unless you're really doing really heavy, really, really high-end stuff, you can stick to 8-bit. It's fine, right? You don't need to worry about shooting larger. It's going to create larger file types when saving things out, and it's just usually not that useful for most people. So that brings me to color space. So, Jeremy, how many color spaces can you name off the top of your head?
Oh, Jesus, not that many.
Yeah, I used to be able to name a ton. I can't name that many anymore. But I will say that the main color spaces that you're going to be thinking about is Adobe 98, right? Which is your typical standard RGB color space. And then sRGB, which is a color space that has less gamut, and sRGB has less information in it. It's typically what you'll see a JPEG saved as is an sRGB color space. It's built more for web. Then you have some web color spaces, which get rid of even more colors, but that's because they're rendering only the colors that are going to be showing on a web browser anyway. Those typically you won't use unless you're using for design work. If you're using an image JPEG, you're typically going to go with sRGB. And then you have all of your CMYK color spaces. CMYK only for print. If you are not going to print anything, just stick to RGB. It's pretty simple. The main one for print production, you're going to have some sort of Grackle web colors or Grackle print color space. That's going to be when you actually print something and you're printing it on a proof, and then those proofs are going to be checked for color, and then you're going to go back and forth and do adjustments in Photoshop for how things look, print it again, double check the color again. That's kind of the proofing process. And you're going to be familiar with some of those if you're doing a lot of print work.
And I think an easy way for people to visually understand what that is, that people have no idea, when you get packaging and see like that grid of colors somewhere on it.
Yep.
Then,
those little boxes.
Yeah. And it's like all different colors. That's the print proof version of it, to see how the colors are printing based on what you have on your file.
Yeah. And when things are being proofed, just if anyone ever brings it up and you're trying to understand it, when things are being proofed, every single printer prints a little differently. There's kind of these generic color spaces that printers will use, but the paper that they use, they literally print out this giant grid block of color, and then with a device go in and color calibrate those things. It creates a profile just for that paper on that printer, printing through whatever machine they're using to print it. And basically you're trying to get something as replicatable as possible in the correct color space. If your monitor is calibrated and the printer, like you have the right profile for it, it should print roughly what's on your monitor. And even then, there's always going to be some slight variation, which is why you do the proofing process where you do a print, actually look at the print itself, because that's going to be your one true source of knowledge there. And then you basically make slight adjustments and tweaks, print again, see how well it does. So this is a common practice anytime people are printing for catalogs, billboards, or anytime you see anything printed inside of a store. Sometimes those marketing assets have gone through that type of process. But most of the time you won't need to know anything about that, because you'll still be shooting a raw file. Those raw files are going to be passed off and somebody else is going to handle all that conversion for you. So unless you're really deep into that kind of work, It's not that important understanding it. But I will say that you need to understand sRGB and Adobe 98 pretty well, because those two RGB color spaces serve two very different purposes. Think of Adobe 98 as you get the most wide range of colors. And if you're not doing a web only, even if you're going to convert down to web, you're starting with the most amount of colors. So when you're editing the file, you're not changing the way that when the gamut kind of passes. Think of something that have different shades all next to each other. You're able to work on those with as much information as possible, and then convert down something to a smaller color space like sRGB and a smaller file type like a TIFF or a JPEG. And basically what you're trying to get is that render of that file that gets compressed is going to be as close to, it's going to shift a little, but it's going to be as close to what you started with. If you take a file and you make a TIFF that is an sRGB TIFF, you're basically taking something and you're saying, throw away some of the color gamut, throw away some of the information in the raw file. So you're basically throwing away information in every step, right? If you take a raw file, you open it into Photoshop as a large file type, an Adobe 98, you're throwing away as little information as possible. And that's what you want as your starting point. So I would just think of this as compression is moving to the sRGB color space from Adobe 98, and compression is moving from a raw file to a TIFF or a JPEG. So just think of it in those terms and it'll help you understand. Start big and get smaller towards the end. You don't want to go smaller step by step as you're still working on the file or somebody else is working on the file, because you're going to lose some information every step of the way. There's so many times where you'll have to backtrack and fix something, or the client will come back with revisions. If all you have to do is reopen a Photoshop file that's in Adobe 98 and still high-res Photoshop file, you can make changes and then reprocess out those files, and you're not going to lose information.
Yeah,
So
I think a good way to describe how that compression works that people probably will understand in the real world is, say you have a photo with a beautiful sunset gradient and it's different colors. Every time you compress it, all the computer is doing is taking all those pixels, if you start with the most amount, it's taking those pixels of those colors shifting in the sky and saying, okay, this one's close enough to this color. I'm going to put those two together and try to like merge colors. So the more you compress it, you'll see banding because it is interpolating the different colors and merging them together to use less information so the file gets smaller.
yeah, and it's important to understand, if you're deep in the post side, how to properly save out those files and then double check the files for things like banding and noise and things like that. Depending on what your client wants, in kind of understanding a little bit about where these files are going or what they're being used for might help also just to have a conversation with a post person. A lot of times you will deliver multiple file types to a client. You will sometimes deliver a high-res TIFF and a crop TIFF and a high-res JPEG and a web JPEG. You may deliver all these different file types to a client depending on what they want. If you're doing that yourself, look up some information on how to write actions and just write an action to do all that for you. It'll save you so much time, and you actually can do that not through ACR but processing out a Photoshop file so that it's doing all the conversions correctly, because otherwise you will end up with really crappy tiny files. They'll look bad, right? Because of what Jeremy was talking about with throwing away information and how things end up banding. So in a nutshell, not to get too deep in the weeds, that's really, for most photographers, the stuff you need to know. There's a ton of other file types. There's a ton of other color spaces. But if you just can kind of remember the rule of thumb to start big and deliver small, then you're hopefully not degrading all the hard work you've gone into shooting, and you're actually processing something out. And if you're working with somebody who does post-production, just provide them with the largest file type you can. Give them the raw. If you've done adjustments, give them the sidecar files, and give them exactly what you need on the back end for final file types, and they can process that stuff out for you and just deliver that as a delivery. And then you can just send that on to the client after checking it. But that's pretty much it. We can touch on metadata a little bit quickly. So Metadata is one of those things that used to be super, super important. It still is, obviously. And you start to get into the digital asset management thing. All photographers mostly need to know about metadata is also if you are adding in a copyright or other things in Capture One or in Lightroom or in Bridge, that those sidecar files also hold your metadata that we've been talking about. So if you take a raw file and you add a bunch of metadata in a software somewhere, right? Not in the camera, but like in the actual software itself. And then you basically just send somebody that raw file, that metadata may not stick. If you process out that file through specific software, the metadata will stick depending on your settings, but you should always double check. And if you were to take a raw file without the sidecar file, load it on your computer, if that sidecar file isn't right next to that and it doesn't load through ACR, for instance, or you're not processing it out directly through Capture, the metadata also won't stick. So depending on what metadata your clients want you to have in the files, if they just a copyright for yourself, that's pretty easy to get to stick. But if it's a bunch of information, it's worthwhile doing a little bit of quick testing and saying, what's my normal workflow? Where am I inputting this metadata? And what am I processing out? Or what is my digital workflow? And just double checking those output files for that metadata. It's pretty simple. You just load it right back into whatever software you're using. Look at the metadata fields. Did it stick or did it not stick?
Yeah, and there's a lot of different, that's a always evolving thing. And it's because different companies started controlling how that was put in. It was all, every camera does it different. Everything does it its own way. There's been effort to put it all into one version that would work across the board, and it just hasn't worked yet.
No, there's too many companies involved. Everyone wants to do their own proprietary thing. And I think it's just figuring out exactly what you're using and what's working. So I will say, if you're shooting Canon, you can pretty much load it into ACR and Bridge or Lightroom and go into the metadata, add something into the IPTC core, I believe it's called, and you load it in there. If you process out a file through there, open it through Photoshop, and then process out something, it'll likely stick. I would always just double check whatever your workflow is, that metadata is sticking. It's pretty easy to double check and look in there. So
yeah, and most cameras now, you can, especially for copyright and a few little things, you can load it into your camera.
So if all you need is copyright, that's likely the easiest way to do it. Truth be told, I'm pretty sure if you pass it off to a client, depending on who your client is, they might trash that information if they do like a full buyout or something like that. But Canon also implemented that new weird copyright feature thing through Photoshop, which I've never really played with, but that's another thing that's coming out. So I don't know. Metadata, if your clients aren't requesting it and you don't have to input a lot, I wouldn't worry too much about it. I would maybe just make sure you have the copyright set up on your camera and just shoot and roll with that.
Yeah. All right. One last thing before we go. I had to look these up for the record because I did not know. What does JPEG stand for? Don't look it up. I'm going to see if you can figure it out. You're never going to get this.
I don't know. I would have known this probably a year or two ago, because I think we've looked up a bunch of these file types a few years ago and looked up like, GIF and JPEG and all this stuff, and I would have known it. What's it stand for?
Joint Photographic Expert Group.
Yep. Now we all know.
Never would have come up with that. Okay. What about TIFF? Any guess on that?
Terrific. I don't know.
Tagged image file format.
Yeah, cool.
So you have to remember, all these things were just made up by groups of people early on who were coming up with ways to these were engineers and computer people, how to compress things and how to do things. So it's just like we've talked about, it's just finding what's going to give you the most information to start with, and then you can go down from there to make the best for what your client needs.
Yeah. Think of your digital workflow. I would just start with there. I would just do some testing, right? Like, what do you do with your files? How do you handle them? What's coming out of your camera? What software are you using to actually do anything to those files? Who's doing the post-production on it? What are you passing off to them? What are you getting back? It's pretty simple.
Yeah. Or just shoot film and go to a dark room. You don't have to worry about any of this. And it's going to be I wish.
Yeah, right. Well, thanks everybody. Appreciate it.
Talk to you soon.
Bye.